back to the very beginnings.
This was really, the place to be. By gunsmith John Dowd in Goshen, Connecticut. So he died in March, and he was going to be buried, and they're looking.
Good evening. My name is Susan Roberts Minor. I was born in 1821. That was 200 years ago. I was born to the Roberts family in Sunderland. We were descendants of the fighting Roberts family who fought with the Green Mountain Boys at the Battle of Bennington in the Great American Revolutionary War. I went to school when I was 7 in Arlington. We had a one-room schoolhouse with a pot-bellied stove right in the center, and the children sat all around the edge of the room, and the teacher was in the front. It was mostly girls because the boys had to be home helping their father in the barns and in the fields, Sometimes they came to school in the winter, but that was quite a havoc when they did. I didn't go there very long, though, because we moved to Factory Point. And then I went to school in a bigger, newer schoolhouse up near the Zion Church. I believe the building is still there. The houses were much closer in Factory Point. Factory Point is what you call Manchester Center. But in those days, there were a number of factories there, and so we called it Factory Point. In the later times, the factories left, and the Historical Society said, there are tourists coming to see the beautiful hills and valley, and so we should call it Manchester Center. And then they did. But it was Factory Point when I lived there. The houses in Factory Point were much closer together than they were in Sunderland. But they were the same in that they had the big, huge kitchens. All the houses did in those days. That was where the brick oven fireplace was. And that was the center of the household. I remember sitting around it 3 seasons of the year. You needed it. It was the only heat in the house. And we sat around it in the evening after we had had supper, when we were doing our homework or our handwork. And then we would talk. And you'd sit there and get all warm and cozy. But your backside would be so cold, and you'd have to scurry around and put your back to the fire, and then it would get very nice and warm and cozy. But your front side would be all cold, and you'd have to shiver and turn around and get back so that your front side was next to the fire, and then you'd get all warm and cozy. But guess what? Your backside would be all cold again, and you'd have to scurry around. Oh, it was such a fuss. The houses were very cold in those days. There was no insulation. Why, the bedrooms were so cold that you could see ice on the inside of the windows. And the beds were like climbing into a snow pile. If your mother had time, she would get the bed warmer, and she would put coals from the fire in the bed warmer, and then she would take it and she would run it on a long handle between the sheets of your bed, and that would make them very nice and warm for you. And you'd climb in and, oh, you'd feel so cozy. And then she'd pull the blankets that she'd made for you and the quilts that they'd made for you up to your chin, and you'd be cozy until morning. That fireplace was the center of everything. But then they tried to make us get the newfangled stoves. They were not good for anything. They burnt things and they half-cooked things. They just weren't that good. Finally, we got one of the new Conet stoves. Well, those Conet stoves were a little bit better. But up in the back, where the chimney meets the fire, that's where you put the coffee kettle and the griddle. And then the cakes on the griddle would get hard and brown. It just was not controlled heat. But the Conet stoves had all those different sizes of kettles and shapes of kettles. Oh my goodness, you couldn't figure out which ones to choose to use. My favorite was the Peter kettle. The Peter was about 2 quarts, and you had a little round, and it would had a handle, and it had little legs, and your mother would fill it with water because it was very good for a wash basin, and she'd put it in on the crane over the coals and let it get nice and bubbly, and then pull it out and put it on the table for you. Oh, when it was cold out, that was such a good feeling to have warm water. Oh my goodness, it was lovely. The kitchen's where a lot of things happened. The big loom was set up in the kitchen for most of the year. If the woman wasn't doing anything else, she was spinning and weaving. Woman's work is never done, you know. No. The men would be out in the spring, plowing and then seeding, and then the next thing you know, the shearer would come and he'd shear the sheep, and they'd get all the wool from the sheep and send it to the mill, and the miller would carton it, and he kept the portion for himself that he was due, and they'd send it back in big bolts to us. You could turn one of those bolts into a dozen pairs of socks, and then you take them to the store, and at the store you could trade them for things that you needed. Those bolts we'd pull apart, and you'd spin it, and you'd spoon it, and you'd warp it, and then you'd weave it. Oh, it was a lot of work, but my goodness, you'd come out with a big, big piece of material. It'd be this wide, and then it would be as long as you wanted. You could make blankets, woolen blankets, or you could make any other material that you needed around the house. And the rest of it, you'd send to the factory. And in the factory, they would dye it. And they dyed it colors that the men could wear outside. Then they would send it back to us. They'd keep what they were due, and they'd send it back to us. And there wasn't much cotton in those days. No, but there was flax. We made a beautiful flax. And the flax was white and shining and just beautiful as linen. And you'd use it for sheets and for fine linens and for towels. Oh, it was lovely. And then you used it for clothing too. You could send that to be dyed, and then it would come back, and the men would get shirts and trousers, and women would get frocks. But we liked brighter colors, and we would say, "Can you dye it another color for us?" Our favorite color was maroon. And that's when the tradesman would come. The shoemaker would come with his little bench, and he had all his tools inside, and he would sit on the edge of the bench and have the men put their foot up on top, and he would mold the leather to their feet, and then he would take the tools and their foot would come out and he would tap, tap, tap that leather, tap, tap, tap. That was called whipping the cat. And he would make all the shoes and boots for the men and boys for the whole year. And then the tailor would come, and the tailor would sew together all the clothes for the men and boys. He had to sew it by hand. There were no sewing machines yet. They hadn't been thought up yet. Then the milliner and seamstress would come, and the milliner would make the hats, and the seamstress would make the dresses for the women and the girls. It was lovely. It was a special time of year. We got our Sunday go-to-meeting dress, and that would be our new and fancy dress for the whole year. It was always such a special time. And then last year's dress you got to wear to school. And then it would become the summertime. In summertime, you know, everything had been seeded, the gardens and the fields, and the crops would be growing, and you'd be trying to keep up with them. The men would work from dawn till dusk. It was very hard work, but everybody pitched in. There could be no slackers. Everybody was dependent on each other in order to make everything go. And we did. We had a good time, too. The children had time between chores, and they made fun of the chores, and they did things together. There would be fresh new livestock that were growing up that they'd have to take care of. And we'd go to the orchards together, and we'd find berry patches together. It was great fun. And then the autumn would come, and the autumn was the time of year when you reaped everything that you'd sown. And the men would bring in the hay and the straw and the corn and the barley. And the women would bring in the rest of the gardens that hadn't been brought in yet. Oh, it was a busy time. Well, you'd put the cabbage and the onions and potatoes and carrots and squash in the root cellar. And then you'd dry the herbs that you used for medicine, because the doctors weren't around enough to be counted on. And so you had to have things like pennyroyal and boneset, chamomile, catnip. And then you had the herbs that you used for food. And then you had a few herbs like gentian. And gentian, you used just a little bit of it in water to blue the sheets and your stockings. And it would add just a tint of color to them. Oh, it was so pretty. Yes. And then we canned what was left. We canned all the applesauce and the rest of the beans and tomatoes. Why, you'd can some fish. You'd pickle some eggs. You'd can some meat. And you'd put it all in the root cellar so that it would be there for the rest of the year. Then it would be winter. And the winter was the killing season. And in this killing season, the men and the boys would have to go out and kill the animals that we raised for food. That was hard work. They had to kill them, and then they would take the big legs of the animals and skin them, and then they would chop it into steaks and roasts, and then they would bring it to the ice house, and they would pack it in chunks of ice so that everything was cold all the way up through the next summer. It was hard work. The men worked very hard to do it. Then they made tallow and lard and candles. The candles were very important because we didn't have any light after dusk. You know how hard it is to see with no light. You'd have to be next to the fireplace all the time. So you made as many candles as you could. And then you took those candles and were used one at a time so that you wouldn't lose light later in the season. You'd always have a candle ready. Then you could take any of those things and you could take them to the store, and the storekeeper would trade with you for things that you needed, like flour and sugar. And the storekeeper would take all the things that we brought in to Troy, New York, to the big marketplace. And there he would trade for the things that we needed and trade our goods to the people in the city who needed what we had. Then he would bring back to us the flour and the sugar and spices and tea and coffee and molasses, and somehow there was always a lot of rum. I remember when my sister and I made our first money. My brother George, he was a storekeeper, and he hired my sister and I to pull peppercorns out of a mess of spices that had gotten all mixed up on the trip back from Troy to Factory Point. And so we sorted them for a whole week, and we did a good job. We made $1 a piece. Oh, that was so exciting. My goodness. You know what we did with it? Well, we each bought a dress. This is when they first had dresses in a store. Right in the store, they would have a fully made dress, all sewed up together nice. We thought we just had to have one of them, so we each got one. Well, they were to the floor. They weren't like girls normally had, just below your knee. No, these were like the ladies wore, right to the ground. Oh, they were so beautiful. It was said they were Kate Greenway style. I never knew who Kate Greenway was, but she had beautiful dresses. There wasn't much to be proud of in our villages those days. There were dirt roads, no sidewalks. The houses weren't painted. There were no shutters. There were scraggly fences outside most of the homes, but animals walked up and down the street. Once in a while, an animal would break into a yard. Oh, and we'd come running, us kids. We'd wait to see what would happen. And the lady of the house would come out. Oh, you, get away from here, you big animal, you. And they'd send quick for the farmhand of the animal that owned it. And then they'd come running, and the lady would be saying, shoo, you cow, you, and you shouldn't be here. And he'd say, oh, come, cow, let's go. And she'd say, you're not taking care of your animals. And he'd say, you're not taking care of your fence. And we would laugh. Oh, it was so funny. It was so funny. Eventually, they decided that it was the cow and the fence, and there was nothing to be done. But our villages were getting to be more mature. We were coming together as a community, and that made a big difference, you know? In 1830, there wasn't a rug in either of our villages, and by 1840, we all had rugs. We discovered that when you had a ripped dress or pants, you could take the bits of the material and cut them all up and weave them like you did the wool, and you'd end up with a rag rug. Oh, they were beautiful. They had the bright colors like the maroon in it. Oh, they were just lovely and warm, because you could put them on the floor in the winter and didn't have to walk on the cold wood. And then in a bitter cold day or night, you would put the rag rug over your bed, right on top of the quilt, and then you'd be super warm. It was wonderful. There was a stage that came. Well, they would let off people, and they would pick up people, and they would deliver mail, and then the stagecoach driver would tell you the news of what was going on in Boston and on the coast. We were never quite sure if it was entirely true, but it was fun to listen to. The only other news we got was the Bennington Gazette, which came up once a week. Arnold delivered it diligently. The best day of the week, though, was Sunday. Oh, we loved to go to church together. We were a very religious community. There was a big Baptist church, and there was the Zion Episcopal Church that my family went to. In the later days, when I married my Amen, I got involved in building the St. John's Episcopal Church in Manchester. I took over the mantle from Miss Sophia Orvis, who had so devotedly worked on it for many, many years. And I took over and I diligently did the work that I could as well. Then, when I married Eamon, I was 32. He was a little older than I was, and he'd been married before. He and his wife had 5 children. Then she died. So when I married Eamon, we brought up those children. We lived in the house just to the south of the Equinox Hotel, going toward Bennington. That house still stands, right next to the Equinox. Yes. Oh, we had a lovely family. And then we had 4 more children. Our son John died at birth, but we had the 3 that made 8 children to play in that house, played and ran, and oh, they were such characters. We had such a good time. We worked together and we played together. And it would get late in the day and I'd say, shoot, shoot. And they'd get out of the house and they'd run and they'd build forts and run in the fields and take a swim in the pond or go skating. Or sometimes get into a little trouble, which is right and proper, you know. And when I had finished my chores, sometimes I would go out and I would do things in the community that needed being done too, and go to a quilting bee and work in the church and do my writing. Oh, how I love to do my chronicles of everything that had happened in the village. Those are the things that people need to know about, what was going on, what it was like to be here in those days. And I loved doing it. I got a number of them printed, and then the Historical Society helped me keep them all together and share them with the public. And I'm so grateful to them for that. My Eamon, well, he went to university, and so he became a lawyer. When I married him, he had begun to do right proper political work, and he was the district attorney, and then he was in the legislature and on the judicial committee. He was a representative, then he was a senator, and then he ran as a Whig candidate for the 32nd Congress of the United States of America to represent Vermont. And he won a term and worked in Washington. But he didn't take the second term. He wanted to be back home. So he came back to us. And our family matured, and the communities continued to mature. And we became a thriving community. My Eamon, he died in 1886. He was a good husband. All his papers were kept in the University of Vermont. And I didn't die until 1913. I became very lame in the end, and so I couldn't do much. But my family grew up around me, and I was so happy. We had fun together, and we were happy together. My children are pretty much all buried right around me here and in our community. It is said of Vermont that we had the finest sheep and horses, the most and the best maple syrup, and the handsomest women of any state in the Union. I hope you will keep up with that tradition and and perhaps add a few more things to the list. I thank you for your patience listening to a garrulous old woman.